Hi, I'm Siddharth Varadarajan, and I'm one of the founding members of The Wire. And it gives me great pleasure to you a regular session for The Wire's YouTube members, where I will come before hopefully on a weekly basis to answer questions from you, largely on a big topic of the week. But of course, as members, you are free to ask wider questions about the wire or about the work we do, or indeed about the news agenda. And where, as far as possible, I will try to engage and answer with them. So without further ado, the topic for this week is, of course, this huge story prompted by the announcement in Canada's Parliament by the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau earlier this week, where he went public with an allegation that agents of the Government of India were potentially linked to the assassination of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. He was speaking specifically about Nijjar, who is a khalistan activist in India. He's a wanted man. He is a wanted terrorist. But of course, in the eyes of Canada, he hadn't broken the law, so he was a free man there. And in June 2023, Nijjar was shot dead by two masked assailants outside a Gurdwara in Surrey, British Columbia, which is very close to Vancouver. And the Canadian intelligence authorities and the police had obviously been investigating this murder for the past few months. And according to Trudeau at his statement in Parliament, Canadian Parliament, he said that his government had been examining credible allegations, as he called it, of a potential link between the killing of Nijjar and agents of the Government of India. And he said in no uncertain terms that this was a violation of Canada's sovereignty, and that this kind of interference in Canadian violation of Canadian sovereignty would be unacceptable, and that he wanted the Government of India to reiterate its opposition to violations of international law of this kind. Now, Trudeau's statement was followed up in quick measure by the public announcement of an Indian diplomat being expelled from Canada. They identified him as Pavan Kumar Rai, who was a consular official, minister consular, or Minister Community Affairs in the Indian High Commission in Ottawa. And the Canadians said that he was head of the research and analysis wing in Canada. The RAW is, of course, India's external intelligence agency. And it is customary, I should add that in most major Indian diplomatic missions abroad, India would post officials who are linked in some way to the intelligence agencies. This is quite normal. And in the case of Hardeep Singh Nijjar and his assassination, clearly the Canadian government was implying that Pavan Kumar Rai in some way was perhaps linked to those who killed him, although they haven't exactly laid that allegation directly at his door. So after the Canadian announcement, the bombshell, as it were, which came late at night in India, I think it was early morning, in fact, around 3 or 4 in the morning, when New Delhi woke up, the MEA announced that it was expelling a Canadian diplomat. And of course, since then, over the past 2 days, there's been a distinct chill in the relationship between Canada and India, which has anyway not been in good shape over the past few months, largely related to India's allegation that Canada is not doing enough to contain or control the activities of Khalistan-related extremists in Canada, and the Canadian allegation that India is somehow interfering in Canada's internal affairs. So feel free to chuck questions at me related to this incident and its consequences, its implications. And I'll begin with the first question that we received prior to this program, which has to do with how was such an incident even possible? Aren't we friends with America, with Joe Biden? How did this happen? Well, we are dealing with Canada here, not the US, but obviously the question is pointing in the direction of the fact that the US is a close ally of India, and the US is also a close ally of Canada. Now, while there have been allegations of assassinations in the past, of Russia, for example, killing Russian citizens or attempting to kill Russian citizens abroad. There was the famous case of Sergei Skripal, who was a former Russian intelligence agent who was poisoned along with his daughter several years ago. And there have been other instances of Russia doing that, of Israel doing that, of the US doing that. But all of those incidents of targeted killings have happened in a very different context. They've been laid at the door of one government, which has been accused of committing a crime on the territory of another government of another country, but the target country was never really a friend or an ally. And certainly there's never been any instance in the recent past of one democracy targeting the citizen of another country on its own territory. Even if we go back to the 70s, when the government of Golda Meir in Israel assassinated, I believe, something like 9 or 10 Palestinian activists in the wake of the terrorist killing of Israeli sportspersons at the 1972 Munich Olympics. The people killed or the people targeted were not, even though they were killed in Italy or France and so on, these were Palestinian emigres or PLO operatives who were working or stationed in France, Italy, and so on, Germany. The crimes took place committed by Israel in France or Italy, but the people killed were not Italian or French citizens. So this, if the Canadian allegation is true, this is perhaps the first instance in recent memory of a democratic country targeting the citizen of another democratic country in this way for a targeted killing on its soil. And this is unusual, right? Because Canada has good diplomatic, economic, cultural, diasporic ties with India. Canada is also a close ally historically and has deep civilizational ties with the US. And India is building a close relationship with the US. So this is unusual for this kind of an incident to have happened or for the allegation to be laid. And right now, frankly, none of us has enough information to judge the validity of the Canadian claim. I want to underline the fact that so far the Canadian side has not provided any information or evidence about this Indian role in the killing of Nijjar. So until that information is available in some form in the public domain, and we are able to judge it, we will have to simply treat this as an allegation, as an unfounded allegation, one that Canada has leveled against India, but which we have no way of judgment on. You have the Canadian allegation, you have the Indian denial, and now it's a question of how the world at large is going to perceive this. And I think what our questioner is trying to get at is how is the US going to navigate its way in this very tricky terrain where one close friend of the US, which is Canada, has laid a breathtaking charge against another close friend of the US, which is India. And at stake clearly is the issue of the sort of US-India relationship, where the US sees India as a potential partner and ally, particularly in the context of its growing competition with China, particularly in the context of the Russian war against Ukraine. And clearly, this is a complicating factor. There was a piece in the Washington Post, a story, a couple of days ago, which quoted unnamed officials as saying that the US side is rather wary of where this conflict between India and Canada is going to go, given that India is a close partner of the US. That story, or at least a part of it, has now been officially denied both by the Canadians and the US. The story in the Washington Post had said that Canada had requested the US to make some kind of a joint statement with it on the basis of the information that it shared, and that Canada was rebuffed. Both the US and the Canadian side on the record are now saying that story is not true. Denials of this kind are pretty rare, so I think it's fair to take that denial at face value. But it's clear that the US is on the horns of a dilemma. It can't completely ignore what the Canadians are saying without jeopardizing its close historical, cultural, civilizational ties with Canada, quite apart from the fact that Canada is an ally of the US in NATO, in NORAD, nor can it fully take Canada's side without causing anger and consternation in New Delhi. So how the US intends to navigate this is something that we'll have to wait and watch. There's a second question that's come in from Purnima Tikku, who is a member of the Wires YouTube channel. Thank you, Purnima. The question that you're asking is, does the Khalistan movement carry so much traction? Isn't it localized more or less to Canada, UK, Punjab? I mean, we may need intelligence, but how much of a clear and present danger does it pose? Now, your question in a way presupposes that the Canadian allegation is true. I'm going to set that aside. So, as I say, we are still agnostic on the question of who killed Nijjar. Is the Canadian allegation correct, or is the Indian denial correct? But the question you ask about the strength of the Khalistan movement is a very valid question. And I've often wondered about the extent to which the Modi government has, shall we say, exaggerated the extent to which the Khalistan movement poses a danger to India today. Now, we know that in the 80s, in the 1980s, in the 1990s, the Khalistan movement posed a very serious challenge to the Indian state. The various terrorist groups that owed allegiance to the slogan of Khalistan were involved in numerous incidents where innocent people were killed. And perhaps the deadliest single terrorist incident to come out of that movement was the 1985 bombing of an Air India flight from Montreal to Delhi, the Kanishka. This was a jumbo jet that was blown out of the sky over the Atlantic. Clearly, the plan for that bombing was executed by Khalistani militants in Canada. A number of arrests were made. One guy was convicted. A couple of people were acquitted. And India has never fully been satisfied about the way in which the Canadian side handled the Kanishka issue, both in the run-up to the bombing and in the aftermath. And I should say that even in Canada, this is a matter of controversy. We know that the RCMP, which is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and the CSIS, which is the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, screwed things up badly. There's even talk of the CSIS having had a mole among the plotters, but yet they dropped the ball. So the Kanishka bombing is a terrible blot on essentially Canada's relations with India, because Canada failed to act in a timely way to prevent the bombing, and after the bombing happened, they dragged their feet in terms of the investigation, and the matter was never fully resolved to India's satisfaction. But since the 90s and since the first decade of the 21st century, and particularly over the last 10 years, the Khalistan movement today is dormant. It's moribund. I wouldn't even say that there are pockets of this movement in Punjab, because if you look at the last 10 years, you'd be hard-pressed to point to incidents of violence, incidents of terrorism that you can trace back to Khalistan militants. There are many reasons for this. I think that life and politics and the political economy of Punjab has moved on. It's not today what it was in the 80s or 90s. I think that Pakistan, which played a big role in fueling the Khalistan movement in the 80s and 90s, moved on by the end of the 1990s to the Jammu Kashmir front. And even that front today is much less active than it was even, say, a decade ago. So I would say that in Punjab, the Khalistan movement does not present a danger. Yes, there is a political manifestation of Khalistan sentiment among the Indian diaspora, among the Sikh diaspora in North America and Canada, perhaps to a smaller extent in Germany, maybe to a smaller extent in Australia. But by and large, this is a political manifestation. Now, here I want to point out that under Indian law, saying certain things may land you in trouble. But in Canada, those things don't land you in trouble. So if Khalistan activists in Canada say that they want to organize a referendum among Sikhs in Canada as to whether they favor Khalistan or not, in India, the government may have the legal power to somehow ban that and to arrest people doing it. But in Canada, certainly there is no such law, right? So India has been objecting to the propagation of Khalistan ideas. This referendum is a major irritant. Plus, of course, you have a lot of loose talk and threats being issued by Khalistan activists in the US and Canada, which India feels should not be allowed. But clearly, Canada and the US have to act as per the constraints of their law. And this is, shall we say, the source of the sort of irritation between India and Canada, where often the evidentiary standard required for the Canadian authorities to take action is not the same as what India believes is required, right? And a few months ago, India tried, for example, to get Gurwant Singh Pannu, who is leader of the Sikhs for Justice, which is a major North America-based separatist organization. And India wanted Interpol to issue some kind of a notice so that Pannu would not be able to travel, and if he were to travel, he could be arrested and sent back to India. And Interpol basically said that no, the Indian request did not contain enough information for them to issue that kind of a circular. So there is this gulf between India and the US, India and Canada, India and virtually other countries, all countries where you have a major Sikh diaspora, which is why you have this impasse that we want to prevent Khalistan activists from speaking and agitating, but there is no easy way under Canadian or US law for that to happen, and I think this is a problem. There's a second question that's come in, which is that there are over 3 lakh Indian students in Canada, making them the largest community of international students in the country. Could India's jumpy response to Trudeau's allegations create a bigger problem? I think that this is a fair question. I wouldn't be surprised if Indian students in Canada are feeling a little rattled because you have a large Indian community in Canada, and Canada is one of the preferred destinations for Indian students to pursue not just higher education or MAs or PhDs, but even BA degrees or technical training courses. Many of them aspire to perhaps settle down and work and make a career in life in Canada. So the idea that Canada and India would be at loggerheads, there's now talk, for example, of making the visa regime more difficult. I saw an announcement that the Indian missions in Canada are suspending the issuing of visas to Canadians for operational reasons, quote unquote. It's possible that there may be some similar retaliatory move by the Canadian mission in India. I don't know. But yeah, all this is going to make people jumpy. But I think that somewhere down the line, it's important that students not panic. Students should carry on, go about their normal life. This isn't something that ought to directly concern them. States have differences of opinion all the time, and diplomatic relations can get testy. But I don't think that students studying in Canada should worry too much about this sort of issue, and nor should they worry unduly about questions of personal safety. I know that the government of India has issued some kind of an advisory for Indians in Canada to be cautious. I hope that this advisory has been prompted more by some sense of diplomatic anger rather than by any credible allegations or threats of potential violence. But I would imagine that the Canadian law enforcement, to the extent to which there are threats against Indian students or others, would be acting on this and treating them fairly seriously. There's a question by Sanjay Kumar, who's also a member of the Wires YouTube channel. And Sanjay asks, will this adversely affect India's relationship with Europe? I think this question is a fair one, because the unusual nature of this confrontation between India and Canada is that Europe, like the US, is good friends with both countries. And the last thing that France or the UK or Germany or Italy will want to do is be asked to pick sides. And I think that more than anybody else, they would be hoping that this issue goes away. But for this issue to go away, clearly, I think India needs to address the concerns that Canada has raised. I don't think it's enough for India to simply say that the allegations are false. I think the government is entitled to state that. But I think that somewhere down the line, the government should also say that it is willing to look at any information or intelligence that the Canadian side has and is prepared to share. We should note that Trudeau used his words quite carefully. He spoke of credible allegations, and he spoke of a potential link. Right, so he stopped short of directly laying the blame for Nijjar's killing on the government of India or on government of India officials. Right, so I think that Trudeau's words provide some kind of wiggle room for India to say, look, as a responsible country, as a country that believes in the rule of law, as a country that upholds international law, we are perfectly willing to look at this intelligence, provided Canada shares it with us. And let's not forget that in the aftermath of the horrible terrorist attack on Bombay, the 26/11 terrorist strike, right, when the Taj and the Oberoi and Chabad House and Leopold Cafe were hit, and a couple of hundred people were killed by Lashkar-e-Taiba terrorists who had been sent by boat from Pakistan. India accused Pakistan, but India also was prepared to share the intelligence that it had, which pointed to the involvement of Pakistan-based terrorists, with not just friendly countries, but eventually that dossier was shared with Pakistan too. So I think that India is within its rights to ask Canada to share this information, to share this intelligence. And I think that that would be perhaps a better way to publicly handle this confrontation, rather than to allow it to escalate into a war of words or into a series of escalating reciprocal actions. So far, we've seen one diplomat from either side being expelled. There is now this sort of unknown question of the issuing of visas. But I think it's important that India and Canada diffuse the situation. And I think this is what our friends in Europe and the US, and I dare say around the world, would be hoping that India and Canada are able to do. There's a question that's come in. Does it seem like a well thought out move to escalate tensions with a country like Canada? Could there have been a different, perhaps better response to the allegations that Trudeau made? But let me rephrase this question. I think I would rather say, since the crisis was triggered not by something India said publicly, but by something Canada said publicly, right? So the question to ask is, the allegation that Trudeau leveled in Parliament, was this flippant? Was it casual? Was it off the cuff? Or did Canada agonize over the statement? Did they think through what the consequences of this would be and decide that even though this was a very serious charge and would have pretty serious consequences for the bilateral relationship, they were going to make that statement anyway? I ask this question because there's been a lot of analysis and discussion in India that what Justin Trudeau said was prompted perhaps by domestic political considerations. And people are pointing to the fact that Trudeau's Liberal Party, which has been in power, and Trudeau is PM for a second term. The current Canadian Parliament was elected in 2021, and it's a 5-year term, so will last. Elections will be held next in 2026. Trudeau's Liberal Party does not have an absolute majority of its own. It depends on the support of the New Democratic Party, the NDP, which is currently headed by Jagmeet Singh, who is a Canadian of Indian origin, of Sikh origin, who is said to be pro-Khalistan. And so the reasoning is that somehow, in order to placate the NDP at a time when Justin Trudeau's standing in the opinion polls has sunk or is not doing great, Trudeau has somehow upped the ante in order to curry favor with the NDP and with the wider Sikh Canadian population. I think I find this explanation a little hard to swallow, for the simple reason that the NDP is not simply Jagmeet. The NDP, there are 25 MPs. This is a party in Canada of long standing and cannot simply be labeled as a pro-Khalistan party. The NDP stands for lots of other issues. But I think more importantly, the consequences for Canada are so great, as you know, in terms of what Trudeau has said, that I doubt very much that this is an allegation that he would have leveled purely for some expedient political gains, especially since there is no indication that the NDP was going to withdraw support, nor are elections due for at least another couple of years, 3 years. But frankly, I think that if the Canadians have made this allegation, if Trudeau has made this allegation, this is not something that has a decision that has been taken lightly. I think they've weighed this through. We know from what Trudeau said and what the Indian side has also said that that the Canadians raised this privately with Narendra Modi. We know that the Canadian NSA has made 2 or 3 visits to India over the past 4 months. So presumably at the NSA to NSA level, the Canadian side has already perhaps shared its misgivings or its information with the Indian side and not got a satisfactory response, which is why Trudeau decided to go public. So I think that the Canadian side has thought this through. And similarly, from the Indian point of view, I think that when you are confronted with this kind of allegation, whose consequences are so grave, right? I mean, like, I don't think the Indian government could brush aside what Trudeau said and assume that it's going to go away. It obviously required a strong denial, and that's what states do, right? Regardless of whether a state is guilty or not, that's what states are going to do. We know that Pakistan, despite Pakistan knowing that 26/11 happened thanks to Pakistan-based terrorists, the government there was in denial for the longest possible time, right? So, and again, I'm not saying that the government of India had a hand in Nijjar's killing, but even if it did, or even if it had information, the last thing that any government is going to do is admit this, right? So India was expected to come out strongly, but I would say that it's important for India to temper its denials with some kind of a statement saying that it is willing to look at this evidence or information if the Canadians are prepared to share it. And I think that then shifts the ball back into the Canadian court, and the Canadian side would then have to say, what is it that, what's the basis of its allegations? There is a question that's been asked by Rajesh Mishra, who says, why has the Indian National Congress taken a non-liberal and undemocratic position on this issue while it is fighting for democracy in India? And I think, Rajesh, you are referring to, I've seen tweets by Jairam Ramesh and by Shashi Tharoor, which in a way, I think Jairam is more direct. Jairam Ramesh said that India has the right to fight terrorism any which way it pleases, which to my mind is quite a kind of shocking statement to make, because the government of India is not saying that it did what Canada said it did, let alone justifying it, right? So it's a bit surprising for the Congress party to somehow justify the killing of Nijjar as a part of the fight against terror, when the government of India is strenuously denying any involvement. And of course, Tharoor is saying that this is not the first time that Tharoor pointed to the sort of amnesia of Western media, which is speaking of only Russia or Iran as having assassinated people abroad, and not speaking about Israel or the US. But as I said in my response to the first question, this is perhaps the first time that one country a democratic country stands accused of killing the citizen of another democratic country on that country's soil, right? So this is quite different from what Israel or the US has been accused of in recent years. As to why the Congress is saying this, well, I think, in general, whenever there is a major diplomatic standoff between two countries, it's not unusual to see the opposition line up behind behind the government of the day, right? So this doesn't surprise me. I think the Congress has decided that since they don't have full information on this, and the government has denied the Canadian allegation, there's no reason to say anything contrary. So, frankly, it doesn't surprise me what the Congress has done. I wouldn't necessarily link it to the wider issues about democracy that the Congress party is raising within the country. Another one of our members has asked, Sunita Reddy, she's asking, are we seeing a revival of a fear of flying in and out of Canada? My answer to that would be no. I think that the Canadian and Indian governments are, the last thing that they're going to do is to jeopardize the safety of air passengers or jeopardize the safety of each other's nationals in this kind of a situation. I don't see, despite the war of words, any kind of risk to or the danger that I think that sure there is a case to be made for Canada and India to be more alert to the possibility of terrorist threats, but I don't think that the last time I flew out of a Canadian airport was a couple of years ago, and the level of security was as you would expect, as you see in India, as you see in the US, and I don't think that people should fear flying between the two countries. There's a question by Ruffle, ROFL, not their real name, but they're asking, not related to the current topic, but just a suggestion. A little more ground reporting and making the content more engaging, because the wire raises pertinent issues which must reach a wider audience. Fair question, Ruffle, and we will address this and come to it perhaps later. Okay, question from Rajesh Mishra. Is really the demand for Khalistan as an independent nation, is it a terrorist demand? Is it a national movement of a kind? How can you say that it is violent at this juncture of history? Much water has flown down the Mackenzie River in 1985. I think this is a fair question. Look, I think that we need to separate out political demands for secession from violence and terrorism, right? And I think you're fair to make that distinction. I would say Indian law is kind of ambivalent on this. Even though you have Supreme Court judgments which clearly lay out that sedition, the charge of sedition, must involve the incitement or call to violence. Right? The famous case from the 80s was of a Sikh man in Punjab who I think had shouted Khalistan Zindabad, or I think in Jalandhar or Ludhiana had raised slogans, and he was arrested for sedition. And the Supreme Court said that there was nothing in what he said which was contributing to violence, and finally that the charge of sedition couldn't hold. So this is the Supreme Court's view, which bears out what you're saying, that as long as you don't advocate violence, as long as you're not involved in violence, then the right to free speech should apply to you. This understanding of the Supreme Court is not always respected by the police. So you have people in India frequently being arrested simply for espousing political views that the government doesn't like, or political views which are secessionist or separatist in some way. And that, of course, is very different from engaging in armed activity or terrorist activity. So I would say that today, the Khalistan movement, there is no militant or armed or terrorist manifestation of it. So in my eyes, this is a political movement. It is a political demand. In my view, this is a demand or a movement that ought to be opposed, but it should be opposed politically. People should argue against it. There should be, if somebody is advocating separatism, then others should advocate its opposite and explain why that person is misplaced. If somebody resorts to terrorism, then of course they have to be dealt with differently. But as of today, there is no indication that the Khalistan movement as a terrorist movement is operating in Punjab. There's a question that's come in. Canada wanted other ally countries to put out a joint statement, but that didn't happen. Could that be something that India is banking on in its response to the allegations? I think that's a great question. And it goes back to what I said right at the start, which is that, no country that is a friend of Canada and a friend of India wants today to be forced to choose one side or the other. So I would say the US and the UK and Australia in particular, as part of the Five Eyes group of countries which share intelligence and security cooperation. I don't think these countries, despite being very close allies of Canada, want to be in a situation where they burn their bridges with India. And clearly, issuing some kind of a strong statement in their eyes would do that, right? However, what you've seen are calls by the US. And now we've seen, I think, 3 or 4 distinct statements from the US, from the National Security Council spokesperson, from Eric Garcetti, who's the US ambassador in India, and a couple of other people on the record that they are very concerned about what Canada has said, that they have been closely coordinating and cooperating with the Canadians, that they want India to act on what Canada is saying. And I think that those words convey the extent to which the US is unwilling to let this issue go. So it's telling India, as tactfully as it can, that this is a question that you have to address, and that a blanket denial isn't going to cut any ice. It's a different matter that with billions of dollars worth of defense deals on the anvil, lots of trade happening, and the larger question of what the US wants India to do, how the US wants India to work with it to deal with the threat of China. These are all factors which are going to limit what the United States will want to do. There was a very interesting piece in today's New York Times, which spoke about the dilemma that the Biden administration faces in its relations with both Saudi Arabia and India. To my mind, it was a bit galling to have India clubbed together with Saudi Arabia as an authoritarian country, as a country that doesn't respect the rule of law. But if we set that aside, the story was sort of recording how the Biden administration wants to pursue geopolitical goals with both Saudi Arabia and India, and therefore is willing to be less focused on the so-called rule of law or democratic concerns that it might otherwise have been, right? So this is a dilemma that the US is grappling with, and I think that what the US would want India to do, and I think going by a story that was there in the Hindustan Times today, where there's a suggestion that India has conveyed privately to the US and Australia and the UK that it's willing to look at the Canadian evidence. This is perhaps one way that India and Canada can move forward. And the Canadian side can save face by having the Indians say, okay, we will look at this evidence. And the Indian side can put this problem behind it by saying, look, we're not burning our bridges with Canada. We're saying, fine, you've laid this serious charge. Let's look at the charge. Of course, sooner or later, India will have to make some statement on the quality of this information or evidence that Canada presents it. And I don't think the government of India will say that this intelligence is very good. But at least you kick the can down the road and you get past this current impasse. There's a question from Arvind Sinha, who's a member of our YouTube channel. Why has Khalistani activity increased in the last 3 years? That's a great question. By Khalistani activity, Arvind, I presume you mean the sort of political activity and campaigning, because that's the manifestation that I see, right? There is no evidence that Khalistan-linked terrorism has resurfaced, but there is definitely a more visible presence of Khalistan propaganda. You see it on social media. Of course, India has blocked a lot of the YouTube and Facebook profiles of Khalistan-related groups, but we do know that this movement is vocal, and they are latching on to some of the recent developments in India in order to raise their own profile, right? And I would say that a bitter question that we need to confront, and I'm throwing this out for people to consider, that when India has begun to move away from its own secular identity, right? Until now, the strongest argument that India could make against six separatists or any other kind of separatist movement was that, look, India is a secular democratic country. It's a federal country that essentially respects the rights of all religions. No one religion has primacy over the others. This is not a Hindu country. This is not a Hindu nation. It's not a Hindu nation state. India is a secular country, right? And the law treats all religions equally. That had been the strongest argument that India could make to refute demands from people who said that there should be that the only way to defend Sikh rights would be to have a separate state for Sikhs, and this was a claim that that India would refute by saying, "Look, we are a secular democratic country. We are a federal country." Of course, the Indian government, successive governments, made terrible mistakes and committed terrible crimes over the last 3 decades. It's useless to try to brush those under the carpet. I think the massacre of Sikhs in Delhi in November 1984 is an issue that has never gone away. And despite successive governments promising to do justice, there is only one senior leader, Sajjan Kumar, who was implicated in the 1984 genocide, who today is in jail. Lots of others haven't been investigated or punished. So this is an unfinished agenda. But I would say that with India today, under Mr. Modi and under the Bharatiya Janata Party and the RSS, consciously trying to push away the country's secular identity and emphasizing the fact that this is a Hindu country, that we are trying to pursue Hindu Rashtra. Obviously, you are going to encourage others to think and speak in this way. So if you have a rising salience of Hindu nationalism in India, it doesn't surprise me if those who espouse the cause of Sikh nationalism are going to feel emboldened by what's happening, right? So a major reason for the revival of this kind of thinking among the Sikh diaspora, I think, has to do with the fact that Hindu reactionary, revanchist, or fundamentalist thinking in India is gaining more traction, and you have these kind of ideas, supremacist ideas, Hindu nationalist ideas being encouraged and endorsed by people who are in power. And I think that this is something that they need to really think about, because the consequences of trying to pursue the Hindutva agenda for India, for the safety and security of India, is something that I think that the Hindutva votaries need to, they need to be held to account, because what they are doing is endangering all of us. There's another question from Deepak Lakhani. Is it possible for the opposition to reject the election bill? Look, this is off topic. I believe you probably mean the women's reservation bill, I don't know, or the election commission bill. Look, the government has the power to push this through Parliament. And I think the election commission bill, if that's what you're talking about, to the extent to which it goes against the grain of what the Supreme Court said, like the spirit of the Supreme Court's judgment was that the selection of an election commissioner should be on the basis of a collegium that is not fully dominated by the government. And what the government has done is it's set up a selection committee where the government is going to dominate. So I think that's a fair ground on which to go back to the Supreme Court, quite apart from some of the other changes that the government has introduced, which is going to ensure that election commissioners are in some way beholden to the executive branch. And I think that the opposition is likely to oppose that. In what forum? I think most likely in the courts. Okay, so we have another question here. This is from somebody who calls themselves Humanity and Peace. The same issue of Khalistan is with Kashmir also. Why the government is very serious with Kashmir and not Punjab? If any separatist asks to separate Kashmir, will that be the same situation? I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I think that look, India as a country, as a nation state, has dealt with challenges, separatist challenges from Punjab and in Kashmir. And these challenges have to be dealt with in a political manner, to the extent to which those challenges are political. And those challenges have to be dealt with through security means, to the extent to which these challenges pose themselves as a security threat. Right? So I don't think that the government of India looks at Kashmir or Punjab differently. But this takes us, this is a wider kind of topic. Maybe we can do an AMA on the government of India's policies, particularly the Modi government's policies towards Kashmir. Maybe this could be a topic for another week, maybe closer to the time when the Supreme Court is getting around to issuing its judgment on 370 or just after that. So I will definitely come back to Kashmir, and we can do an AMA on Kashmir. But for now, let's keep the focus on Punjab. There's a question from Lieutenant Colonel Neeraj Pant. Should India really get worked up because of protests in Canada, US, and Britain by the Sikhs in favor of Khalistan? Because there is no buy-in in the state by the Sikhs in Punjab and outside of Punjab. I think, Colonel Saab, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is something where I believe the Modi government has overreacted. You have a political movement among a small section of Sikhs in Canada, perhaps in the US, perhaps in Australia, perhaps in Germany, that is vocal and that is engaging in separatist propaganda. Counter that politically by all means, but I think the government has overblown this threat and is probably doing it for political reasons. I think that you saw the way in which when the farmers in Punjab and Haryana and West UP protested against Modi government's farm policies, right? This was one of the largest peaceful democratic movements involving lakhs of people in India, perhaps the largest sustained protest that we have seen in 70 years. And the government's response, the Modi government's response to that protest was to try to treat it as a law and order issue, right? So you had a lot of propaganda presenting the farmers as somehow being motivated by Khalistanis. You had a lot of BJP leaders trying to present the farmers of Punjab as being separatist. So somewhere down the line, I think that this tendency to exaggerate the threat posed by a handful of Khalistan activists abroad is linked to this domestic agenda of discrediting peaceful democratic protest inside the country. And I think that the government is doing a great disservice, not just to the farmers, but also to India as a country. Because you are, by claiming a link which does not exist, you are allowing Khalistani separatists to take on a larger-than-life persona. You are giving them a higher profile than what they actually have. And I think that this is something that again, the Modi government and the Hindutva supporters as a whole need to seriously think about, because their pursuit of narrow domestic, political goals in this fashion is actually creating more problems for India than it is solving. There's a question from Priyankar De, who's a member of our YouTube channel. Whom do you think can be the face of Prime Minister for the 24 India Alliance? Okay, again, look, we're going away from the topic. So I noticed you've asked a second question on international matters. Do you think that there should be a strong motion against Canada by the world leaders for allowing Khalistani separatists in their land to operate? Look, Priyanka, that's, again, a good question. I see many people asking this on social media. Again, we need to be very clear about what we are talking about, right? I think the government of India has every right to tell the Canadian side that we oppose the political activities of Khalistani groups in Canada. Of course, India as a country cannot expect Canada to crack down on these elements unless these guys break Canadian laws. So if India has information that Khalistan elements inside Canada are engaging in some kind of unlawful activity, for example, plotting terrorist attacks in India or inciting violence, I think that that information should be given to the Canadians, and that becomes a valid demand for India to make, and for India to tell the whole world that, look, Canada needs to act against these guys. But if the Indian demand is merely going to be, how can you allow a referendum in a Gurdwara in BC, where Sikhs are coming and voting for Khalistan? How can you allow this to happen? I don't think the Canadian government will take that demand very seriously, and I don't think the world at large will support India, because at the end of the day, the Canadian definition of free speech is what's going to operate in that country. And you cannot expect the government of Canada to criminalize activity such as organizing a referendum among people who are in Canada. That is not a crime in Canada, right? So I think that the government of India needs to, in a way, be rational about what demands it makes and how it chooses to escalate those. Where we have evidence of individuals in Canada who have been involved in terrorist crimes, I think we should go to town. Where our objection is mainly political, I think that we should be a little bit more measured and tempered in how we go about ensuring that India's point of view is heard. There's a question from Shahid Akhtar, who's again a member of our YouTube channel. Considering the BJP and Sangh Parivar's anti-Muslim policy, what's the future of Indian Muslims in India if they again win the election? Okay, again, this takes us off topic, Shahid Bhai. I assure you that a future AMA, we will deal with the concern that you've raised. But since you've asked it, my 10 seconds worth is that I think that all Indians, need to think very carefully about the direction this country is taking. And this is, of course, there is a challenge that Muslims themselves directly have to confront, because they are the targets of a lot of the BJP's policy, and they are the targets of a lot of the communal politics of the Hindutva groups. So how you deal with this challenge and how the country as a whole deals with and overcomes this challenge is a question that I think everybody should debate. But this is an issue which I promise we will come back to in a future AMA. Okay. Should not, Kalpana Murari asks, should not India react only when there is domestic disturbance by separatists? It could be just a distraction or something else more related to elections in India. I think, look, let's look at the sequence here, right? India has said what it said in response to what Trudeau alleged, right? So in a way, it's Trudeau who has set the current confrontation rolling by going public. I'm not going into the merits or demerits of what he said. He probably had his reasons for saying that, or that's something that we have to debate. But the government of India has reacted to what Trudeau said, and I don't think that India had any option but to react. I think, to my mind, a better reaction would have been to deny the charge, but also to say that please share whatever credible allegations you have, so that the Indian side can look into those. I presume the reason why India hasn't said that is because maybe the Canadians have shared some of this information privately. So a lot more information is probably going to come out over the next couple of weeks if this matter continues to escalate. But yeah, I mean, the wider question that you're asking is, should India be that concerned about the activities of Khalistanis in Canada? I agree with you. I don't think we should. To the extent to which those activities have a direct bearing on violence in India, of course, no government can ignore that. But so far, the kind of violence that we've seen, right? If you look at what are the major law and order issues confronting Punjab today? You have the drug menace. You have the activity of criminal gangs, the killing of Sidhu Moosewala, for example. You have this guy Lawrence Bishnoi in jail, involved in the killing of Moosewala. So you have criminal groups that are active. You have a large underworld fueled by the drug trade. These are very serious issues that the government has to deal with. I'm not sure that there is a link that's been established between these very realistic problems that India is dealing with and the activities of Khalistanis abroad. Yes, there is an issue of optics. There is an issue of the propaganda that these groups are engaging in. I personally find a lot of what this Pannu guy says to be highly objectionable and distasteful, and he's somebody who should be argued against and countered. But the means to do so has to be political, right? And I think that trying to divert or convert a political challenge into a law and order challenge or a security challenge or a terrorist challenge is not always the smartest thing to do. We really have run out of time. I've hope that I've answered the questions in the main that you guys have, and I hope to be able to come back. As I said, we want to do this once a week. So if you are watching this and you are not a member of the Wires YouTube channel, please sign up. You'll find a link in the description or elsewhere on our homepage, our YouTube channel page. I believe it costs as little as 89 rupees a month. And what you will get in exchange for being a member is privileged access to sessions such as this, where you can put your questions to me and to other colleagues at The Wire. I hope that in future sessions, we will have our other founding editors, M.K. Venu and Siddharth Bhatia, to handle your questions. Our senior editor, Arfa Khanum Sherwani, the Wire's editor, Seema Chishti, our political editor, Ajay Ashirwad Mahaprashta, our national affairs editor, Sagita Barua Pishroti, and other colleagues who have specialized knowledge that you may benefit from, or certainly may benefit from engaging with. So with that, I thank you again for watching. Do let your friends know about our membership program, and keep watching The Wire. Thank you so much.